7 years she was on the run. 7 years she was silent, rebuilding everything from the ashes, a new name, a new life, a child who would never know his father. But today the cafe door opened and the man the entire underworld feared walked in. And before Elena Cross could even breathe, her 6-year-old daughter ran out, clutching an old photograph, looked up at the stranger and asked, "Mommy, is this him?" An innocent question, a question that shattered 7 years of lies. Press like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has come. Stay tuned to the end, because this isn't just a love story. This is a story about what people do when forced to choose between survival and truth. The coffee grinder had been broken for 3 days, and Elena still hadn't fixed it. She told herself it was because the replacement part hadn't arrived yet, which was true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she liked grinding the beans by hand now. The repetition of it, the ache that spread from her palms up through her forearms by mid-morning. It gave her something to focus on that wasn't the sound of Rosie laughing in the back room, or the way the fog sat heavy over the street outside, or the particular gray quality of the Portland sky in October that looked, if she let herself think about it, almost exactly like the sky over New York 7 years ago. She didn't let herself think about it. The cafe was called Groundwork, and it sat on the corner of Halsey and 28th, in a neighborhood where the buildings were old but not charming, and the residents were working class and mostly kept to themselves. Elena had chosen it specifically for those qualities: no foot traffic from tourists, no one interested enough in their neighbors to ask too many questions. The sign above the door was hand-painted in plain black letters, and the interior was small. 8 tables, a short counter, a chalkboard menu that she rewrote every morning because Rosie liked to watch her do it, and sometimes asked to hold the chalk. That was her life. That was the whole of it, and she had worked hard enough and bled enough to build it that she did not take a single ordinary morning for granted. It was 7:14 when Marcus came in. Marcus was 62, retired from a freight company, and he took the same corner table every day and drank 2 cups of black coffee and read a physical newspaper folded in quarters the way men of his generation did. And Elena had never once asked him anything personal about his life, and he had never asked anything personal about hers, and that was the foundation of a friendship she genuinely valued. She set his cup down without being asked. He grunted. She took that as thanks. The next 2 hours were routine. A young woman came in with a laptop and headphones and ordered an oat milk latte and took up the table nearest the window for 4 hours the way she always did on Tuesdays. A construction crew from the building going up 2 blocks over sent their youngest guy in for a tray of 6 drip coffees, which he fumbled at the door on the way out, and Elena handed him a rag and told him it happened to everyone, even though she was already calculating whether she could absorb the cost or needed to charge him. She charged him. She had a daughter. Rosie appeared at 9:30, dragging her backpack by one strap across the floor in that way that made Elena's teeth clench every time. "Backpack on your back," Elena said without turning around. "I know." Rosie didn't put it on her back. "Rosie." "I know, Mom." Elena turned and looked at her daughter. 6 years old and already developing the particular brand of selective hearing that Elena recognized from her own childhood, which her own mother had described as exhausting, and which Elena now understood was an understatement. Rosie had her dark hair, the same stubborn set to her jaw, but her eyes were something else entirely. Pale gray, almost silver, eyes that Elena had told herself 1,000 times could have come from anywhere, from nobody in particular, from the general lottery of genetics. She had been lying to herself for 6 years, and she was good at it. "Eat something before school," Elena said. "I had cereal." "That's not something, that's cereal. Eat a piece of toast." Rosie made the face, but sat down at the small table behind the counter, where Elena kept a stool and a clip-on reading light for her, the one piece of the cafe that was unambiguously theirs and not for customers. Elena put 2 slices of bread in the toaster and went back to restocking the pastry case, listening to Rosie hum something tuneless and complicated to herself, the way she always did when she thought no one was paying attention. This was the life, this small, ordinary, protected life. The bell above the door rang at 9:47. Elena didn't look up immediately. She was repositioning a tray of blueberry scones and the configuration wasn't working, and she was focused on the problem in the way she focused on small logistical problems, with a concentration that was partly genuine and partly a learned behavior, a way of narrowing her attention so that the larger, unresolvable problems couldn't get in. She heard the footsteps cross the threshold, heard them stop. Something in the quality of the silence made her look up. He was standing just inside the door. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had just convinced herself over 7 years that he was ordinary-sized, that memory had inflated him. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie, the collar of a gray shirt open at the throat. He hadn't changed in ways she could easily name and had changed completely in ways she couldn't. His face was harder. Not older, exactly. Harder, like something had been stripped away and what remained was purely functional, the architecture of a man who had stopped accommodating softness. Lucien Vale. The tray slipped from Elena's hands. It didn't fall. She caught it, both hands coming up fast, muscle memory from 3 years of working a cafe counter, and the scones shifted but didn't spill, and the sound was just a small clatter that meant nothing to anyone in the room except her. Her hands were shaking. She set the tray down very carefully on the counter and kept her eyes on it for 2 full seconds because she needed those 2 seconds before she could trust her face. She looked up. He was still there. He wasn't a hallucination. She had imagined this moment so many times in the first 2 years, not with longing, with dread, with the particular sick anticipation of someone waiting for a consequence they know is coming. And then she had stopped imagining it because she had needed to stop, because Rosie needed a mother who was present and not haunted. And she had worked hard at not being haunted. 7 years of work, undone in 3 seconds. His eyes found hers across the 8 feet of counter space between them and didn't move. She said nothing. There was nothing to say first. There was too much to say, and the weight of it compressed everything into silence, and she stood behind her counter in her cafe with flour on her apron and her heart performing something violent and irregular in her chest, and she said nothing. Rosie had been quiet in the back for the last 2 minutes, which Elena registered distantly as unusual, and then she heard the sound of small feet on the floor, and then Rosie was there, squeezing past Elena's legs the way she always did, appearing at the gap in the counter like a declaration. And Elena's entire nervous system lit up with the specific panic of a mother who needs to stop something and doesn't know how to do it without making it worse. Rosie was holding something, a photograph. Elena knew which photograph before she could see it clearly. She knew it the way you know something in a nightmare, not from evidence but from the certainty that the worst version of any situation is always the one that happens. It was the photograph from the kitchen drawer, the one Elena had kept because throwing it away felt too much like a ritual, like an acknowledgement of grief she wasn't ready to perform, and so she had put it in the drawer beneath the takeout menus and the spare batteries and the expired coupons, and told herself she had simply misplaced it. Rosie walked straight to the end of the counter, stopped in front of Lucien, and looked up at him with the directness that 6-year-olds deploy without any awareness of its power. She held up the photograph. "Mom, is he the man in the picture?" The words landed in the quiet cafe like something dropped from a height. Marcus looked up from his newspaper. The woman with the laptop pulled one earbud out. Elena stood behind the counter and did not move and did not breathe and felt the last 7 years arrange themselves around this moment like walls closing in from all directions. Lucien looked at the photograph. She watched him look at it. Watched something move through his face that he controlled almost immediately, the way he controlled everything, with the practiced discipline of a man who had learned that visible emotion was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities got people killed, almost immediately. Not quite. He looked at Rosie. His expression did something she had never seen it do before in all the years she had known him, and she had known him at his worst, and in the dark, and under pressure, and in the specific aftermath of violence. She had known him when he was calculating and cold and frightening, and she had known him in the rare moments when he wasn't any of those things. But she had never seen this. He crouched down, which brought him level with Rosie, and he looked at her daughter's face, and Elena watched him put the math together in real time, the age, the eyes, the jaw, all of it. And she watched the calculation complete itself. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet and controlled and entirely unlike how she remembered his voice. "That's me." Rosie studied him with the clinical interest of a child assessing a new situation. "You look different." "I'm older." Your hair's the same. You're very observant. Rosie seemed to find this satisfactory. She looked back at Elena, telegraphing the specific expression that meant she was processing information and would have questions later, and then she tucked the photograph under her arm and disappeared back through the gap in the counter toward her stool. The cafe returned to its ambient noise. Marcus's newspaper, the hiss of the milk steamer Elena hadn't turned off, the wet sound of traffic outside. Elena and Lucien looked at each other across the counter. "I need a coffee," he said. She almost laughed. It came up from somewhere involuntary, and she suppressed it hard, because if she laughed, she would cry, and she was not going to do either of those things in her cafe in front of her daughter and two witnesses. "We're out," she said. His mouth did something that was almost a smile and was entirely exhausted. "Elena." "Don't." The word came out sharp and low, automatic. "Don't say my name like that, not here." He stood, the full height of him again. He put both hands in his coat pockets, which she recognized as his version of a neutral stance, the posture that meant he was choosing not to be threatening. He had always known what he looked like to other people. He had always been precise about what he chose to project. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. "You being here is the trouble." "I know." He said it simply without argument. "I know that." The honesty of it disarmed her slightly, and she hated that it did. She turned away from him and poured a coffee she had just said they were out of and set it on the counter with more force than necessary. "Sit down," she said, "away from my daughter." He took a table near the door, far from Rosie, and he sat with his back to the wall and his hands around the cup, and he didn't try to talk to her again immediately. She went about the business of the morning, and she felt his presence at that table like a change in atmospheric pressure. Everything in the room slightly altered, slightly charged, the way weather feels in the hour before something bad. She got through the next 40 minutes on autopilot, made Rosie's toast, helped Rosie with her backpack, walked Rosie to the door and watched her join the line of kids heading toward the school 2 blocks away, kissed the top of her head, and then stood in the doorway until Rosie disappeared around the corner. When she came back in, Marcus was folding his newspaper. "Early day for me," Marcus said, leaving money on the table. He paused at the door and looked at Lucien, the brief assessing look of one older man sizing up another, and then he left without comment. He was perceptive, Marcus. He'd earned it. The woman with the laptop left 5 minutes later, laptop bag over her shoulder, not meeting anyone's eyes, gone. Elena locked the front door. She turned the sign to closed. She walked to his table and stood across from him and crossed her arms and looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time since he'd walked in, without the counter between them, and without witnesses, and without Rosie 3 feet away. He looked tired, profoundly, specifically tired, not from sleep deprivation, but from the kind of tiredness that accumulates in the body over years, the tiredness of sustained alertness, of never being in a place that was safe enough to relax in. She recognized it. She had felt it herself for the first 2 years, before Portland, before groundwork, before she'd built the walls high enough to stand behind without exhausting herself. "How did you find me?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "It doesn't matter how." "It matters to me." He looked at the table for a moment, then back up at her. "Someone saw you at a distributors conference in Seattle 8 months ago. Recognized you from..." He paused. "From before." Word moved slowly. "I didn't get it until 6 weeks ago." 8 months. She had been at that conference for one afternoon, a distributor she'd been trying to get better pricing from, and she had worn her hair differently and used her business name, and she had thought, she had believed, that she was invisible. 6 weeks, she said. "You took 6 weeks." "I needed to be sure it was you before I..." He stopped. Something in his jaw tightened. "I needed to make sure coming here didn't bring anything with it." "Did it?" He didn't answer immediately, and that non-answer told her more than any words would have. Her stomach dropped. "Lucien, I took precautions." "That is not an answer." "I was careful." He looked at her directly. "I was very careful. But you need to understand what's been happening in the last 2 years on the East Coast. There are people who..." "Stop." She held up a hand. "I don't want to hear about the East Coast. I don't want to hear about any of it. I left that world. I left it completely. I built something here that has nothing to do with any of that, and whatever is happening over there is not my problem. Elena, she's 6 years old. Her voice dropped to something quiet and very hard. She's 6 years old and she goes to school 2 blocks from here, and she has a teacher named Miss Ferris, who she thinks is funny, and she has a best friend named Yuki, who she calls on the phone every night, and she has never once in her entire life had to be afraid of anything, and that is not an accident, Lucien. That is the result of 7 years of decisions I made every single day, and you are not going to walk through that door and undo it. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. She has my eyes, he said quietly. The words hit her somewhere she didn't have armor for. She turned away from him and walked behind the counter and stood with her back to him for a moment, her hands flat on the cool metal of the counter surface. She had known this would come. She had told herself she'd prepared for it. She had played out versions of this conversation in her head in the first year, in the second year, less often in the years after that as the threat of it seemed to recede, seemed to become something theoretical and distant rather than real. But here it was. Here he was. You should go, she said, not turning around. I need to tell you something first. Lucien, I never stopped looking for you. His voice was steady and low and had that quality it got when he was being completely truthful, the quality she had learned to distinguish from his operational voice, his performance voice, the half-dozen ways he modulated himself depending on the situation. This was the voice she had heard maybe a dozen times in all the years she'd known him. Every letter I sent in the first year came back. Every number I called was wrong or dead. I hired 3 different investigators, and 2 of them... He stopped. I thought you were dead. For 2 years I thought you were dead. She turned around slowly. He wasn't performing. His hands were loose around the coffee cup, and his face was too still, the stillness of a man holding something painful at an exact measured distance. Then why, she said, did I spend 7 years believing you chose not to come? Something shifted in his expression. What did you believe happened? I believed what I was told, that you knew where I'd gone, that you knew and you chose your organization over. She stopped herself, breathed. I was told you made a choice. Who told you that? She didn't answer. His eyes went very precise and very cold, not toward her. The coldness was pointed elsewhere, toward something she couldn't see, something internal. He was calculating. She had seen this before, and it still made the air in the room feel different. Who told you that, Elena? She crossed her arms tighter. It doesn't matter now. It matters more than anything else in this room right now. She looked at him for a long moment. The rain had started outside. She could hear it on the windows. The particular rhythm of Portland rain, that steady, indifferent sound she had come to associate with safety, with home. 7 years of that sound. 7 years of telling herself she didn't need the answer to certain questions because the questions themselves would destroy the walls she'd built. Danner, she said. The name left her mouth and she watched what it did to Lucien's face. Danner, his lieutenant, the man who had been beside him for 8 years, the man who had been in the room the night everything fell apart, the man who had come to her the following week with the message she had believed without question because she was 26 years old and terrified and alone, and Danner had known things only Lucien could have told him. The coldness in Lucien's face didn't shift. It deepened, became something absolute, and then he locked it down, and what remained was very controlled and very still and far more frightening than anger would have been. He's dead, Lucien said. Danner. He died 11 months ago. Before he died, he stopped. Before he died, he talked. Elena's arms loosened. She stood behind her counter and felt the floor shift very slightly under her, not literally, but in the way the ground moves when you restructure the architecture of 7 years of belief, and the foundation turns out to be built on what someone else wanted you to think. What did he say? She said. That he intercepted everything, both directions. My letters to you, your attempts to reach me. He had help inside the organization. It was a coordinated... Lucien stopped himself the way he sometimes stopped himself when he was about to say something operational to someone who wasn't equipped for operational language. He wanted us separated. He had reasons that go back before I understood what he was building. He ran it for 3 years, and by the time I started to suspect, You'd been gone for 2. She said nothing for a very long time. The rain on the windows, the distant sound of a truck on Halsey. You're asking me to believe, she said finally, that everything I've believed for 7 years was a lie someone else built. Yes. On the same day you walked in here and found out you have a daughter. Yes. And you want me to… what? Just accept that. I want you to understand it. I'm not asking you for anything else right now. I just need you to understand what actually happened. She turned and looked out the window at the rain-dark street. A woman was walking past with a stroller, hunched against the weather. 2 guys from a delivery service were arguing over a route on their phones. Ordinary life. Her ordinary life, which had taken years to build, and which she had believed was solid and finished. She heard him stand, heard the scrape of the chair. I'm staying in the city, he said. For now. I'll give you time. She didn't turn around. Don't come back here. A pause. All right, he said. For now. She heard him walk to the door, heard the lock click as he turned it from inside. She had forgotten she'd locked it, forgotten he was still inside. Heard the bell above the door, the same bell that rang every morning, every ordinary morning, every morning she had built this life on. The bell rang, and the door closed, and he was gone. She stood behind her counter for a long time after that. The rain kept coming. She didn't move to unlock the door or turn the sign back to open. She stood in the quiet of the cafe with her hands on the counter and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, because she owed herself that much, because refusing to feel it wouldn't make it smaller. Rosie had his eyes, had always had his eyes, had always had the jaw too, and the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something. Elena had looked at her daughter's face every single day for 6 years and loved it completely and separately from what it meant, the way you could love a fact and despise the context that created it. He had come. 7 years late, and through a door she hadn't left unlocked, but he had come. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She didn't know what it cost her to believe it, or what it would cost her not to. She only knew that Rosie would come home from school at 3:15 and want a snack, and want to tell her about whatever had happened with Yuki that day. And Elena would be here for that, would be present for that the way she had been present for every ordinary afternoon for 6 years. She was still standing at the counter when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Portland area code, or what looked like one. She answered because she always answered unknown numbers, the habit of someone who had spent years slightly tense about news arriving from unexpected directions. Ms. Cross. The voice was male, professional, with the specific flatness of someone reading from a script or choosing words with great care. My name isn't important. What's important is that the man who visited your cafe this morning was followed here. Her grip tightened on the phone. You should know, the voice continued, that we've been watching the cafe since 6 a.m. We know about the girl. And we know whose girl she is. The line went dead. Elena stood in the empty cafe with the dead phone in her hand and the rain coming down outside and the bell above the door still faintly resonating in the air from when Lucian had left, and understood with a cold and terrible clarity that the ordinary life was already over. Elena called him back on the number she didn't have. She didn't know how she expected that to work. She stood in the middle of her locked cafe holding a dead phone and realized she had no way to reach him, no number, no address, nothing. She had spent 7 years making sure of that, and now the absence of a way to reach Lucian Vale was a problem with immediate practical consequences. She tried to think, the rain on the windows, her own breathing, which she made herself slow down by force of will, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the technique a therapist in her 2nd year in Portland had taught her when the nightmares were bad, the technique she still used when the walls felt thin. Someone had followed him here. Someone had been watching the cafe since before he arrived, which meant they'd known he was coming before he walked through the door, which meant the surveillance wasn't reactive. It was anticipatory. They had been ahead of him, and they knew about Rosie. She unlocked the front door and looked both ways down Halsey. The rain made everything indistinct, a parked sedan 20 meters east that she didn't recognize, a van on the opposite side with a company logo she'd never seen. Both of them could be nothing. Both of them could be exactly what she was afraid of. She had never had to read a street before, and she had lived in this neighborhood for 4 years, and she did not know how to do this, had never wanted to know how to do this. She went back inside and locked the door. She called Rosie's school, asked them not to release Rosie to anyone but herself at the end of the day, and to call her if anything unusual happened. The woman who answered, a tired administrator named Carol, who Elena had spoken to maybe twice, sounded puzzled, but agreed. Elena gave her a second number, her personal cell, and made Carol read it back. Then she stood in the middle of the cafe and understood that she needed Lucian. The thing she had been telling herself all morning, that his presence here was the problem, that the solution was his absence, collapsed in about 30 seconds of practical thinking. He was the problem, and also the only resource she had for understanding the problem, and that was either a trap or a terrible coincidence, and she didn't have time to determine which. She knew where he was staying. She hadn't asked, but she knew. There was only one hotel in Portland where a man like Lucian Vale would stay. Not the most expensive, because expensive was visible, but the kind of mid-range business hotel with enough turnover that no one looked twice at anyone. She had worked the neighborhood for 4 years, and she knew the properties. The Meridian on Burnside. 6 blocks from the cafe, which was not an accident. She took off her apron and put on her coat and locked groundwork behind her and walked through the rain. She didn't call first. Calling first gave him time to prepare what to say, and she wanted to see his face when she said it. The Meridian's lobby was the color of institutional beige, with 2 armchairs and a reception desk, and a bank of elevators that probably hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. She crossed to the desk and said she was here to see Lucian Vale, and the woman at the desk said there was no guest by that name, and Elena looked at her steadily and said she'd wait in the lobby, then. She'd been sitting in one of the armchairs for 4 minutes when the elevator opened and Lucien walked out. He stopped when he saw her. Just for a second. Just long enough for her to see the surprise, which he controlled immediately, but not quite fast enough. He came and sat in the chair across from her. There was a low table between them with a small lamp that cast the kind of light that made everything look like a problem. "Someone called me," she said. "After you left. Unknown number." His face didn't change, but his attention sharpened. She could feel it, the way a room feels different when the barometric pressure drops. "What did they say?" "That you were followed to the cafe. That they've been watching since 6 this morning." She kept her voice level. "That they know about Rosie. That they know who she is." He was still for 3 seconds that felt much longer. "Say that again," he said. "You heard me." "I need to hear it again." "They said they know whose daughter she is, Lucian. They said it like it meant something specific." He stood up and she had a half second of thinking he was going to walk away before she understood he was just moving. Moving because he couldn't sit still with what she'd just told him, the same way he'd always moved when he was containing something that needed containing. He took 3 steps toward the elevators, stopped, came back. "How long ago?" he said. 40 minutes, maybe 45. "And Rosie's at school?" "Yes, I called them. They know not to release her to anyone but me." He sat back down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him, and he looked at the floor for a moment with an expression she didn't have a name for. Then he looked up at her. "Who else knows you're here?" he said. "No one." "Did you check the street before you left?" "As much as I could. I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I don't do this. I haven't done this in 7 years. I don't know how to read a street." "I know." He said it without judgment, which was somehow worse than if he'd been critical. "I know you don't. So tell me what's happening." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him calculating what to tell her and how much, the same calculus he'd always done. Not because he wanted to keep her in the dark, but because he had spent his entire adult life managing information as a form of protection, and old habits of thought were the hardest to break. She had hated it when she was 25, and she hated it now, and the hatred was useful because it kept her from the other feeling, the one underneath, the one she wasn't ready to examine. "In the last 2 years," he said carefully, "an organization called the Vashti Group has been consolidating power on the East Coast. They've been moving into territories that used to be controlled by other people, my people, historically." "Your people," she said flatly. "Yes." "Go on." 3 months ago, they made an approach through intermediaries. They wanted access to certain assets, holdings that have been in my family for 2 generations, property, investments. Some of it is structured in ways that are... He paused. The ownership documentation is complicated. Some of it can only be transferred with a direct bloodline verification. Not me, an heir. The last word sat in the air between them. Elena felt the cold travel up from the base of her spine. A biological heir, she said. Yes. And they know Rosie exists. Now they do. His jaw was tight. They didn't, until today. He stopped. That's the only thing I got wrong. The only thing. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The lamp between them made the shadows in the room work against both of them. You brought them here, she said. Her voice was quiet and completely controlled, which was worse than if she'd raised it. You took 6 weeks to decide it was safe, and you were wrong, and now my daughter is on a surveillance list. Yes. That's all you have? Yes? I made a mistake. He said it straight, no softening. I was wrong about how clean my approach was, and it put her in danger, and I have to live with that. Right now I need to focus on what happens next, not on... Don't. She stood up. Her chair made a noise against the floor. Don't manage me right now. I'm not one of your people. I'm not a situation to handle. You just told me my daughter is being watched by an organization that wants to use her as a legal instrument to access money, and you want to skip past the part where you're responsible for that. He didn't flinch. He absorbed it, the way he'd always absorbed direct impact, not by deflecting, but by going very still and letting it land. You're right, he said. I know I'm right. I'm not arguing with you. You're doing that thing where you agree with me, so I'll move on faster. Something passed through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite the opposite. I'm not. I'm agreeing with you because you're right, and because there's a time component here, and I need you to help me think through the next 8 hours, and that requires you to be here, talking to me, instead of somewhere else. She stood over him for another moment. Her coat was still damp from the walk over. The rain was still coming down outside, audible even through the hotel's walls. She sat back down. 8 hours, she said. By tonight, I can have people here. 2, maybe 3 individuals I trust completely. We put them near the school, near the cafe, near wherever you're staying. I live above the cafe. He absorbed this. That's not ideal. It's my home. I know, I'm not asking you to leave it. I just need to know the layout. She looked at him. You need to know the layout of my home for protection purposes. 7 years ago, I would have told you that's not something I'd ever allow. 7 years ago was different. Is it? The question came out with an edge she hadn't entirely intended and landed somewhere that made him go quiet. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back up at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, he said. I've been honest with you. I know. I need you to stay that way. He looked directly at her, the full weight of it, the thing she'd forgotten about being looked at by Lucian Vale, that when he actually looked at you, you felt it in your sternum. Did Danner contact you before you left New York? Did he come to you directly? She held the eye contact. Yes. What did he tell you? She'd rehearsed this answer for years, the version of events she'd put in order in her head so she could look at it without it destroying her. Saying it out loud to him was different. Saying it out loud to the man it was about was different in ways she hadn't fully calculated when she walked through the hotel door. He came to me 6 days after you disappeared, she said. He said you'd surfaced, that you'd been in contact with him, that you knew I was at Kate's apartment and that you'd chosen not to. She breathed through her nose. He said you'd made a decision about what the organization needed, that I was a liability, that you told him personally to make sure I understood it was over. Lucien was very still. He knew things, she said before he could speak. He knew things about us that I'd never told anyone, things you would only know, specific things. I know what he knew, Lucien said. His voice had dropped to something flat and controlled. I told him things. Early on, before I understood what he was. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has been beside you for 8 years. He paused. He built his lies on top of the truth. That's why they held. She looked at the lamp, the small, dim light of it. She thought about 26-year-old Elena Cross sitting in Kate's borrowed apartment with a pregnancy test she'd taken twice to be sure, waiting for a man who'd been told she was a liability. I was pregnant when he came to me, she said. Lucian made a sound she'd never heard from him before, short and involuntary, like something had hit him somewhere unarmored. She looked back at him. His face was controlled but barely. She could see the effort of it, the jaw, the hands, the set of his shoulders. You were pregnant when you left, he said. Yes. And you were alone. Yes. Elena, don't. She stood up again because she needed to be vertical. I don't want your grief about it right now. I managed it. I managed all of it. I had her and I kept her safe, and I built something that worked, and she doesn't know fear, she doesn't know any of it. And I did that by myself, and I'm not going to let you make that about your loss right now. Not right now. He stood too. Not toward her, just standing. They were both standing in this beige hotel lobby with the lamp between them, and 7 years, and a dead man's lies, and a 6-year-old girl 2 blocks away at school, drawing pictures and telling Yuki about her morning, and completely unaware that her entire world was being renegotiated by 2 people who had never agreed on anything except, once, each other. What do you need from me? He said. Right now, today. What do you need? She thought about it seriously because she owed herself and Rosie serious thinking. I need to know who called me, whether it was a threat or a warning. There's a difference? If it was a warning, there's someone inside whatever's surveilling us who has a reason to want us out ahead of it. That's a resource. If it was a threat, it was designed to make me panic and make mistakes. He looked at her with something in his expression she recognized distantly. The specific quality of his attention when someone had said something that surprised him by being competent. She had hated it when they were together. The faint surprise of it, the way it implied he'd expected less. She still hated it. It was probably a warning, he said. If the Vashti group wanted to move on Rosie directly, they wouldn't call first. A call creates a record, creates reaction time. They'd move. So someone inside is trying to help us, or trying to flush us, make us run somewhere they can control. He picked up his phone from the table, she hadn't noticed it there, and looked at the screen. I need to make a call. I need 30 minutes. Can you stay? I need to be at the school at 3:15. It's 11:40. I'll have you out of here by 1. She sat down. He walked to the elevator, not inside it, just to the corner of the lobby where the angle of the wall gave him some acoustic separation, and he spoke quietly into his phone in a register she couldn't quite make out. She watched him without appearing to watch him. The way he held the phone, close to his mouth, the way his free hand moved in small contained gestures while he spoke. She recognized all of it and hated that she recognized it, hated the intimacy of knowing someone's physical habits, the way that knowledge persisted regardless of what you did to the emotional record. She had not let herself miss him. She was clear about that. She had grieved what she'd thought had happened, and she had moved through it and out the other side, and she had built a life that was whole and real, and whatever she felt now was not the reopening of something that had been closed. It was the discovery that the closure she'd achieved was based on a false account, and that was a different problem, a structural problem, one she would have to address carefully and without the kind of feeling that made people do stupid things. He came back 15 minutes later, not 30. I have a name, he said. He sat down, leaning forward again, the same posture as before. The call to your phone came from a burner registered to a service address in Thai Guard. The service address traces back to an LLC that has no real business activity but has a registered agent who worked with Vashti's legal team in 2021 before leaving under unclear circumstances. She stared at him. You got all of that in 15 minutes. I have people who are good at this. In Portland. I have people everywhere. He said it without inflection. The man who left Vashti's legal team was a fixer named Reyes. He handled documentation, transfers, the legal architecture of their asset acquisitions. If he's burning phones and calling you, he's not working with them anymore. Why would he help us? He might not be helping us. He might be playing both sides. But he knows something specific enough to know about Rosie, specific enough to have your number, And that suggests he has access to intelligence that's current, not historical. He's been inside recently. So we find him. My people are already looking. He paused. There's something else. She waited. The surveillance on the cafe started before I arrived in Portland, he said. I got here yesterday evening. You said they were watching since 6 this morning. She felt the implication before he said it. Which means they weren't following you, she said. They already knew where you were. The room was very quiet. For how long, she said. I don't know, but it means the 8-month timeline. Someone recognizing you at the Seattle conference. That may be when the Vashti group got the information. Not just when I got it. They may have been watching you for months. She thought about the last 8 months. Every ordinary day. Rosie at school, Marcus with his newspaper, the Tuesday woman with her laptop, the construction crew. She thought about every face she'd stopped noticing because she'd seen it enough times that it became part of the background. I need some air, she said. Not outside. I know, She stopped. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs and breathed and looked at the middle distance and gave herself 10 seconds to feel the vertigo of it, the nausea of understanding that the safe life she'd constructed might have had a slow leak in it for 8 months while she went about her ordinary days entirely unaware. 10 seconds. She took them. Then she looked at him. The cafe isn't safe, she said. No. My apartment above it isn't safe. No. Rosie can't go home today. No. She said the next thing slowly because she needed to hear herself say it, needed to hear the shape of the concession she was making. You said you have a place, something secure. He was careful not to react to this in a way that would make her feel cornered. She noticed that. Noticed him choosing not to press the advantage. Yes. Outside the city? An hour north. Owned through a third-party structure that's not traceable to me directly. It's been maintained. It's clean. How many people? 2 of mine, already on site. I can have 4 more by tonight. Rosie doesn't know any of this is happening. I know. She's going to have questions about why we're leaving. She's perceptive. She's very... Elena stopped. She thought about Rosie's eyes, which were his eyes, which had always been evidence of the things she'd been trying not to look at directly. She's perceptive, and she's going to want to know why. What do you want to tell her? I don't know yet. I'll figure it out. She stood and straightened her coat. I need to go back to the cafe. I need to get some things before 3:15. I'll come with you. No. Elena, no. If they're watching the cafe and they see us arrive together, it tells them something I don't want them to know yet. I'll go back alone. I'll pack what we need, and I'll pick up Rosie from school, and I'll meet you. Where? A meeting point. Not the cafe, not the hotel. He thought for a second. Powell's. The bookstore on Burnside, 3rd floor, Pacific Northwest section. 2 o'clock before you pick up Rosie. She almost said something about the location, about the almost deliberate quality of it. A bookstore, the most civilian possible meeting point, the kind of place no one expected anything bad to happen. She didn't say it. 2 o'clock, she said. She walked out of the hotel and into the rain and went back to her cafe and stood in the middle of it for a long time, looking at the 8 tables and the chalkboard menu she'd rewritten that morning with Rosie watching. She looked at the stool behind the counter with the clip-on reading lamp. She looked at the tray of blueberry scones she'd been repositioning when he'd walked in, still slightly askew. Then she went upstairs and began to pack. She packed for practicality, not comfort. Documents first, in a waterproof folder. Their IDs, Rosie's medical records, the deed and insurance papers for the cafe, the small amount of emergency cash she kept in the fireproof box under her bed. Then clothes. Enough for a week because she refused to plan further than a week. Rosie's specific stuffed rabbit, the one she called Mr., without which Rosie would not sleep and Elena would not sleep in consequence. A phone charger. Rosie's school library book because it was due Friday, and she would ask about it. The ordinary weight of ordinary life, packed into 2 bags. She carried them downstairs and put them in the back room. She unlocked the front door and turned the sign to open because closing early 2 days in a row would be noticed, and she didn't want to give anyone information. She made coffee she didn't drink. She straightened the scones. She sat behind the counter at Rosie's stool and felt the strangeness of the day pressing against her from all directions. At 1:15, she put on her coat. At 1:47, she walked into Powell's Books. The smell of the place hit her like it always did. Old paper and wood and something indefinably specific to that building. A smell Rosie loved and always tried to name and never quite could. Elena moved through the ground floor without browsing, took the stairs, crossed to the Pacific Northwest section on the third floor, which was quieter than the rest. A back corner with shelving that ran floor to ceiling and a particular quality of amber light from the windows. Lucien was already there. He was standing with his back to the shelves, not browsing, not pretending to browse, just standing there looking at the door she came through, which was the kind of tactical positioning she'd once found reflexively frightening and now just catalogued as a fact. "He's here," Lucien said before she could speak. "Reyes. My people found him. He's at a motel off I-84, been there 4 days. He wants to meet." "When?" "Tonight. He says after dark." "And you trust that?" "I don't trust anything, but I trust that he called you, and calling you was a risk for him, which means he has something to say that he thinks is worth the risk." He paused. "He said something else when my people reached him." She waited. "He said the Vashti Group's interest in Rosie isn't just about asset transfer," Lucien said. His voice was very controlled. "He said they're not planning to use her as a legal instrument." "Then what?" "He wouldn't say on the phone." Lucien looked at her, the full weight of it. "But he used the word leverage. He said she's leverage. The way he said it..." Lucien stopped. The way he said it was not about money. Elena felt the cold again, the specific cold from this morning, from the phone call in the empty cafe. She felt it move through her, and she didn't push it down this time because she needed the edge of it, needed the clarity that fear produced when you didn't let it become panic. "We pick up Rosie," she said. "We go to your place tonight. You meet Reyes. I want someone with you at all times while I'm gone. I don't need, Elena." He said her name the way he'd said it at the cafe, the way she'd told him not to. She didn't stop him this time. "Please." The please landed in a way she hadn't expected. He'd never said please easily. It had always cost him something, the specific currency of a man who controlled everything he could reach. She heard what it cost him now, and she didn't argue. "Fine," she said. "Fine." They stood in the Pacific Northwest section of Powell's Books, while the rain came down outside the tall windows, and Elena thought about Rosie drawing pictures in school 2 blocks from a cafe that was surrounded by people who had been watching her family for 8 months. And she thought about a man named Reyes in a motel off I-84 with something he wouldn't say on the phone, and she thought about the word leverage spoken in a specific tone by a man who knew what the Vashti Group was planning, and she understood with the complete, terrible certainty of a mother who had never let her daughter be afraid of anything, that whatever was coming next would require more than the ordinary life she'd built could bear. The school day ended at 3:15. Rosie would come out the same door she always came out, backpack dragging, looking for Elena's face in the crowd of parents. Elena had 90 minutes. She used them to call Marcus. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting her, which told her that Marcus was not only perceptive, but had been perceptive enough this morning to understand what he was seeing. "I'm going to be away for a little while," she said. "I need someone to water the plant in the front window." A pause. "The little one or the big one?" "Both." Another pause. "You need anything else?" "Keep an eye on the front. Note anything that seems off. Don't engage with anyone asking questions about me." "Elena." His voice was steady, the voice of a man who had seen things in 62 years that he didn't talk about. "You be careful." "I will." "And the girl?" "She'll be with me." "Good." A pause. "I'll water the plants." She hung up and looked at Lucien, who had been close enough to hear both sides and had the decency not to comment. 90 minutes, she said. "I know. After I get Rosie, after we're in your car, after we're moving, I want the full story. Everything about Vashti, everything Reyes told your people, everything you know and haven't told me yet because you were managing the information." She held his gaze. "All of it." He looked at her for a moment. "All right. I mean it." "I know you mean it." He paused. "I'll tell you everything. She believed him. She didn't know yet if believing him was the right decision or the residue of something she'd spent 7 years trying to burn off. She only knew that in 90 minutes she was going to hold her daughter's hand and walk away from the only safe life she'd ever built, and she needed every piece of information Lucian Vale possessed to have any chance of building another one. She left Powell's first. That had been his suggestion, and she'd accepted it for the same reason she'd accepted the bodyguard. Not because she wanted to, but because she was smart enough to recognize the difference between pride and survival, and the difference mattered more today than it ever had. The rain had lightened to something fine and persistent, the kind of Portland rain that didn't commit to being rain, just hung in the air and made everything damp. She walked the 6 blocks to Rosie's school with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes moving the way Lucien had shown her once, years ago, in a different city. Not frantically, not obviously, just a steady peripheral awareness, cataloging what was there and what had changed. A man in a gray jacket on the corner who looked at his phone and didn't move. A car parked across from the school entrance that she didn't recognize but couldn't confirm was wrong. Everything simultaneously ordinary and suspect, the world tilted 3 degrees off its axis. The bell rang at 3:15 and the doors opened and children came out in the particular flood of energy that end-of-school day produced. And then Rosie was there, backpack dragging, obviously, scanning the crowd with those silver-gray eyes until they found Elena. She ran the last 10 feet and hit Elena's side hard enough to stagger her. "I was first in spelling," Rosie said into Elena's coat. "I know you were." Elena held her tighter than usual and pressed her face into the top of Rosie's hair and breathed. Shampoo. Crayon. The specific warm smell of her daughter that she had memorized without meaning to, the way you memorize things you can't afford to lose. "Mom." Rosie pulled back and looked up at her with the diagnostic precision of a child who had learned to read her mother's face the way other children read picture books. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. We're going on a trip tonight." "Where?" "Somewhere new. You can bring Mister." Rosie processed this. "Is the man coming?" Elena went still. "What man?" "The man from the picture." Rosie said it simply, the way she said everything, directly, without performance. "He had sad eyes. I noticed." Elena looked at her daughter for a long moment in the thin rain, at the face that was hers and not hers, at the eyes that had always been evidence of the truth she'd been living alongside without naming. "Yeah," she said quietly. "He's coming." Rosie nodded like this was acceptable, like she'd already run the calculation and reached a conclusion Elena hadn't been given access to yet, and took her mother's hand. They walked toward the car together, and somewhere behind them on the street, something that had been waiting a long time began to move. The car was a black SUV, nondescript, Oregon plates, and it was waiting on the side street off Morrison exactly where Lucien had said it would be. Elena had explained the situation to Rosie in the careful, partial way that mothers explain things to 6-year-olds when the truth is too large and too sharp for small hands to hold. She'd said they were going to stay somewhere new for a little while. She'd said it was an adventure. Rosie had asked if they could stop for food, and Elena had said yes because it was a normal thing to want, and normal things were worth preserving for as long as possible. They got drive-through burgers from a place on Burnside. Rosie ate hers in the back seat with the methodical focus she brought to all food, holding the wrapper with both hands, occasionally narrating the quality of the fries to no one in particular. Lucien sat in the front passenger seat and didn't eat and didn't turn around, and Elena drove because she'd insisted on driving, because she needed something to do with her hands and her body and the part of her brain that kept trying to run catastrophic projections. His 2 people were in a second vehicle behind them, which Elena could see in the rearview mirror and tried not to stare at. No one spoke much for the first 20 minutes on 30 heading north. The city thinned out. The rain had stopped, but the sky stayed heavy and low, the kind of sky that had given up committing to any particular weather, and just sat there in a state of ambient threat. The Columbia River appeared to the right through the trees, and Elena watched it for a moment, wide and gray and indifferent, and thought about how much had changed in the last 8 hours, and how the river looked exactly the same as it had yesterday when she'd driven this road to meet a produce supplier. And the only thing she'd worried about was whether the new pastry flour she'd ordered would arrive before the weekend. Rosie fell asleep somewhere around Scappoose. Elena heard her breathing change in the back seat, the slow, complete surrender of a child's sleep, impossible to fake, and felt the specific relief and specific grief of it, the way children could move into unconsciousness and leave all of it behind, temporarily, just like that. She kept her voice low. "Tell me about Vashti." Lucian turned his head slightly, but didn't fully turn. He was watching the road ahead, the mirror, the tree line, all of it at once, that divided attention she'd forgotten about, the way he was never entirely in the conversation because part of him was always scanning the perimeter. The Vashti group started as a legal entity, he said, import and distribution, Pacific Rim routes. They built legitimate infrastructure first and then used it as cover for everything else. The man who runs it is named Carver. I don't know his full name. No one I've spoken to knows his full name. That's unusual. It's deliberate. He operates through layers, intermediaries, legal fronts, cutouts. In 5 years of trying to get a clean picture of him, I have a physical description and 2 confirmed phone numbers that are both dead. That's it. And he wants Rosie. He wants what she represents. Lucian's voice was flat and precise, stripped of everything except information. My family's asset structure, the legitimate holdings, the property, the investment vehicles, was organized by my father in a way that's functionally a trust without being legally named as one. The controlling interest in the entire structure passes by direct biological succession. When my father died, it came to me, but I never formally documented an heir because I didn't... He stopped. I didn't know there was one. And Carver knows this structure. He has someone who knows it, someone who understood the legal architecture well enough to identify the specific vulnerability. That's what Reyes worked on before he left. She absorbed this. The road curved north along the river. The second vehicle stayed behind them at a consistent distance. He built the legal case for acquiring your assets, she said. Reyes. And then he left. Yes. Why did he leave? Lucian was quiet for a moment. That's the question I need Reyes to answer tonight. The property was 40 minutes north of the city, off a state route that ran through second-growth Douglas fir and occasional cleared acreage. The turn was unmarked. The driveway was a quarter-mile of gravel that ended at a house that was larger than Elena had expected. 2 stories, cedar siding weathered to gray, the kind of functional Pacific Northwest architecture that was built to last rather than impress. The lights inside were on. Smoke came from a chimney at the near end. 2 men came out of the front door when they pulled up. Elena registered them as Lucien's. The posture, the way they stood, the unhurried competence of people who were never surprised. One of them opened Elena's door, which she found immediately annoying, and she got out without acknowledgement and opened Rosie's door herself and unclipped the seatbelt and lifted her daughter, still asleep, against her shoulder. Rosie's head dropped against Elena's neck, warm and heavy and completely trusting. Inside, the house was clean and warm and largely impersonal. Good furniture, but nothing decorative. Nothing that suggested anyone had ever actually lived in it. The kitchen was well stocked. There was a bedroom on the ground floor that one of Lucian's men had prepared for Rosie, with sheets that looked recently changed and a lamp on the nightstand turned to its lowest setting. Elena put Rosie down and stood over her for a moment, watching her breathe. Then she went back to the main room where Lucien was standing with his phone to his ear. He finished the call and looked at her. Reyes confirmed. He'll meet me at 10. Where? A diner off the highway, neutral, public enough that he'll feel safer. I want to come. No. Lucien, someone needs to be here with Rosie. He said it simply, not as a negotiating tactic. I'm not bringing her here and then leaving her alone with people she doesn't know. It was the right argument, and she hated it for being right. She crossed her arms. Then I want a phone. A line to you. Open the whole time you're gone. He looked at her. All right. He left at 9:30. One of his men, the quieter of the 2, stayed inside the house. The other was somewhere outside in the dark. Elena sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea she didn't drink and listened to the sound of the property. Wind in the firs, the occasional settling creak of the house, the distant sound of traffic on the state route. At 9:52, Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was carrying Mr. and her hair was compressed on one side from sleep, and she looked at Elena with the expression of someone who had woken up in an unfamiliar place and was deciding how to feel about it. "Where are we?" she said. "A house north of the city. Someone's house." The man with the sad eyes. "His house, yes." Rosie looked around the kitchen. She pulled out a chair and sat down and put Mister on the table facing outward, which was Rosie's standard protocol for establishing territory. "Is there cereal?" Elena got up and looked in the cupboards. There was cereal. She poured it and added milk and put it in front of Rosie and sat back down and watched her daughter eat and tried to memorize the ordinariness of it, the specific comfort of cereal at 9:52 at night in a kitchen that wasn't theirs. "Mom," Rosie said, not looking up from the bowl. "Yeah." "Are we safe here?" Elena looked at her daughter's face, 6 years old, hair sideways, spoon in hand, asking the question with the directness that she applied to everything. She thought about lying, constructing the age-appropriate version, the reassurance that cost nothing and meant nothing. "Yes," she said, "we're safe." Rosie nodded. She ate another spoonful. "Okay." She believed it immediately and completely, the way children believe their mothers, and Elena sat with the weight of having said it and meaning it and having no guarantee that it was true. Lucien called at 11:17. "He's here," he said. His voice was different, compressed, controlled in a specific way that meant something had already happened that he was managing. "I need you to listen to what he's telling me." "Lucien, what?" "Just listen." There was a sound of movement, a phone being shifted, and then a new voice, male, middle-aged, carrying the particular worn quality of someone who had been afraid for a long time. Accented slightly, southwest somewhere, the consonants clipped. "Ms. Cross," the voice said. "Yes." "My name is Reyes. I worked for the Vashti Group's legal infrastructure for 3 years. I left 8 months ago when I understood what the asset acquisition project was actually intended to produce." A pause, shallow breathing. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not. I need you to understand that I tried to stop it from inside before I left. I documented everything I could. I have the files." "Tell me," Elena said. "The legal case for accessing the Vale family holdings through a direct heir isn't the final objective," Reyes said. "The asset transfer is a mechanism. Carver doesn't want the money. He wants the legitimacy. The Vale name attached to the holdings gives him access to 12 governments' regulatory frameworks that currently exclude him. The money is infrastructure. What he's building is political." A pause. "He needs the child's existence to be publicly established. Official documentation of paternity, birthright, succession. The legal record." Elena felt the chill begin at the base of her throat. "And once that record exists..." A silence. She heard Reyes breathe. "Ms. Cross, your daughter doesn't need to be alive for the legal record to serve its purpose." The kitchen went very distant, the refrigerator hum. The sound of Rosie's spoon against the bowl. Elena's own hand, white-knuckled around the phone, which she could see from a great distance, as though she were slightly outside her own body. "Say that again," she said. Her voice was someone else's voice. Flat, not her own. "Once paternity is established through legal documentation, the biological heir's role in the succession mechanism it's passive. Carver's lawyers have structured it so that a documented heir who is deceased still satisfies the inheritance trigger. They need the documentation. They don't need the girl herself to be..." "Stop!" The word came out of her mouth like something physical. "Stop talking." She was standing. She didn't remember standing. She was standing in the kitchen with the phone at her ear, and Rosie was across the table looking at her with wide eyes, and Mister knocked sideways on the table, and Elena turned her back to Rosie because she could not let her daughter see her face right now. "Lucien," she said into the phone, "I'm here." His voice, close, immediately. "You heard all of it?" "Yes." "How long have you known this was the shape of it?" "I didn't. Not this. I knew they wanted the documentation. I knew they wanted Rosie as a legal instrument, but I didn't know the succession mechanism worked this way. That she didn't need to be. He stopped. How is that possible? Her voice was still flat, and she needed to keep it that way. How is it possible that you spent 6 weeks investigating this before you came to Portland and you didn't know the most critical piece? Because Reyes is the only person who built the legal architecture, and Reyes went dark 8 months ago. No one on my side had this piece. So you came here, she said, without knowing what they were actually planning. You came here and you found us, and you led them straight to us, and you did not know that finding us meant. She stopped herself. She pressed her free hand against the kitchen counter and felt the cold laminate under her palm and breathed through her nose and looked at the cabinet in front of her and breathed again. Elena. His voice was careful in the way of someone approaching something fragile with the awareness that if it breaks, it cannot be repaired. I'm coming back. I'm leaving right now. Don't go outside. Don't open the door. I'm not going outside. She turned back to the table. Rosie was watching her, very still. Mr. Righted in front of her again, the cereal bowl pushed aside. Reading her mother's face the way she always read it, with the precision of a child who had learned to scan for weather. Elena sat down. She put the phone on the table between them, still connected, and she looked at her daughter, and she found, from somewhere she didn't know she had, the completely still surface. Finish your cereal, she said. Rosie looked at her for another moment. Then she pulled the bowl back and picked up her spoon. Is the man coming back? Rosie said. Yes. Tonight? Yes. Tonight. Rosie ate. Elena sat across from her and maintained the completely still surface, and underneath it she was performing a calculation she had never wanted to perform. The calculation of how you protect your child from an organization that does not need your child alive, when the only protection available requires you to trust the man whose arrival made your child visible in the first place. The answer arrived before she'd finished the question. She didn't like it. She was going to do it anyway. When Lucienne's headlights swept the kitchen window at 12:04 a.m., Elena was standing at the front door. She had Rosie's go bag over one shoulder and her own bag over the other, and Rosie was beside her holding Mr. and still carrying the particular unruffled composure of a 6-year-old who had decided her mother had everything in hand. She heard him get out of the car, heard him come up the porch steps. The door opened. He looked at the bags first, then at her face, then at Rosie. Something moved through his expression, the same thing she'd seen in the cafe when he looked at the photograph, the thing she hadn't had a name for. She had a name for it now. It was the look of a man confronting the full dimension of what he had put at risk. Where's Reyes now? She said. Safe house. My people have him. Does he have the files he mentioned? Yes, we have them. Then here's what happens next. She held his gaze. You use those files and you burn Carver's legal structure to the ground before he can file a single document. Not after, not reactively. You get ahead of it and you destroy the mechanism he needs before he can use it. Because as long as that mechanism exists, my daughter's life is a liability to the one person who has the resources to act on it. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. And until that's done, we don't come out of wherever you put us. We don't surface. We don't exist. He looked at her for a long moment. That's going to take time. Then we have time. It's going to require resources, legal exposure, federal. I don't care what it requires. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I care that it happens. He held her gaze and nodded once, a single, complete nod. Then he looked down at Rosie, who was looking up at him with those silver-gray eyes that were his eyes in her face, calm and assessing in the way she assessed everything. I like your house, Rosie said. There was cereal. Something in Lucienne's face shifted. For just a moment, a fraction of a second, the calculation and the control and the operational precision all fell away, and what was underneath was something raw and undefended and entirely real. There's more cereal, he said. His voice was lower than usual. Different kinds. Okay, Rosie said. She walked past him into the house with Mr. under her arm, entirely comfortable, as though the decision had already been made and she'd simply been waiting for the adults to catch up. Elena didn't move immediately. She stood in the doorway with both bags on her shoulders and looked at Lucien in the dark of the porch. with the fir trees moving behind him in the wind and the sound of the state route distant and the specific cold of the Oregon night pressing in from all directions. "If you had told me everything you knew before you walked through my door," she said, "I would have had 8 hours to prepare instead of 8 hours of damage control." "I know. Don't do that again." "I won't." She believed him. She believed him, and she walked past him into the house and outside in the dark somewhere, on a road she couldn't see. A car she didn't know was running parallel to the state route with its lights off, carrying 2 men with a folded piece of paper that had her daughter's name on it, and a date 3 days from now, and a set of instructions that Carver had written himself, in the clean, impersonal language of a man for whom other people's children were simply problems with solutions. The car passed the turnoff for the property without slowing, continued another half-mile north, and pulled onto a logging road where the tree cover was thick enough to swallow the vehicle completely. The engine cut. The 2 men inside sat in the dark, and one of them sent a single text message to a number that routed through 4 different servers before it reached its destination. The message contained 3 words and a set of coordinates. 3 days. Inside the house, Elena didn't sleep. She put Rosie down in the ground floor bedroom at 12:40 and sat on the edge of the mattress until the breathing changed and deepened, and she was sure, fully sure, not just hopeful, that her daughter was gone into sleep and not just lying still in the dark, the way children sometimes did when they were frightened and didn't want to say so. She watched Rosie's chest rise and fall for 3 full minutes. Then she kissed her forehead, stood very carefully so the mattress didn't shift, and went out and closed the door behind her. Lucien was in the main room with Reyes. She hadn't expected Reyes to be here. She'd understood he was at a safe house, which she'd assumed meant somewhere else, somewhere that was not the same physical space as her daughter. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him. A slight man, late 40s, with the hollowed-out look of someone who had been running on adrenaline and bad sleep for months. He was sitting at the table with both hands flat on the surface in front of him, fingers spread, the unconscious posture of a man trying to convince his nervous system that the surface under his hands was solid. He looked up when she came in. "Miss Cross," he said. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. Lucien was to her left, standing against the wall with his arms crossed. She didn't look at him. "The files," she said to Reyes. "Walk me through them." He looked at Lucien. Lucien nodded once. Reyes reached into the bag beside his chair and produced a tablet. He laid it on the table and turned it toward her. On the screen was a document, dense legal language, the kind of architecture that took years to build and was designed to be incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't spent years inside it. "The succession mechanism is here," Reyes said, pointing to a section midway down the first page. "This clause. It was drafted to appear as a standard inheritance trigger, but the language is specific. It requires documented proof of a living biological heir at the time of the original filing, but it does not require the heir to be living at the time of the transfer execution." He paused. "I flagged it internally 18 months ago. I was told it was a standard construction in certain jurisdictions. I accepted that. I shouldn't have." "Why did you leave?" Elena said. He looked at his hands. 8 months ago, Carver brought in a second team, not legal, operational. Men I'd never seen in the offices before, who had no reason to be near the legal work unless— He stopped. "I understood then what the document was actually built to do. I took copies of everything I had access to, and I walked out." "And you've been in Portland for 4 days." "I came here to find a way to get the files to someone who could use them. I don't have federal contacts. I'm a lawyer, Ms. Cross. I built documents. I don't know how to burn them down." She looked at the tablet. She thought about the clause Reyes had pointed to, the clean, impersonal language of it, the way violence could be encoded in legal text so completely that it looked like paperwork. "The federal angle," she said, turning to Lucien. "You mentioned it outside. What does that mean specifically?" "There's an investigator," Lucien said. "Federal Organized Crime Unit. Her name is Voss. I've had indirect contact with her office for 2 years. She's been building a case against Carver's financial network, and she's been missing the legal architecture piece. The documentation that shows how the asset transfers are structured and what they're designed to produce. Reyes's files are the missing piece." "You've been talking to a federal investigator," Elena said, "through intermediaries. carefully. And you trust her. I trust that her interest in Carver is real, and that she has the jurisdiction and the resources to move on him in ways I can't. He held her gaze. I've been building toward this for 2 years. I just didn't have the evidence to give her until tonight. Elena sat with this. Outside, the wind moved through the firs with a low, continuous sound like something breathing. She thought about the 3 days written on a piece of paper in a car on a logging road she didn't know existed, and she thought about the legal clause on the tablet screen, and she thought about Rosie asleep in the next room holding Mr. with the complete unconscious trust of a child who believed her mother had everything handled. She looked at Reyes. How quickly can Voss move if she has these files? With this documentation, she can freeze the filing mechanism within 48 hours, Reyes said. An emergency injunction against the succession documents. Once the legal mechanism is frozen, Rosie's existence stops being an operational necessity for Carver. 48 hours, Elena said. If Voss moves immediately, if she has everything tonight. She looked at Lucian. He was already looking at her. Call her, Elena said. It's 1 a.m. I don't care what time it is. Call her tonight, send her the files tonight, and get the 48 hours started tonight. She kept her voice low and completely level. Because somewhere out there, someone already knows where we are, and 3 days is not as much time as it sounds. Lucian held her gaze for a moment. Then he took out his phone and walked to the far end of the room. Reyes let out a breath that he'd probably been holding for 8 months. Elena sat at the table in the house that wasn't hers, in a life that had been disassembled and reconstructed twice in a single day, and she listened to Lucian's voice low at the other end of the room, and the wind in the trees outside and her daughter breathing through the wall, and she understood with complete clarity that the next 48 hours would determine everything, and that the woman who had run a cafe and packed school lunches and rewritten the chalkboard menu every morning was not entirely the woman who was going to be needed to get through them. That woman was still there. She wasn't gone. But she had company now. The call to Voss lasted 40 minutes. Elena didn't hear all of it. She went back to check on Rosie twice, stood in the kitchen once with a glass of water she didn't drink, watched the window for headlights on the driveway that didn't belong. But she heard enough. Lucian's voice at the far end of the room, low and precise, reading case numbers and entity names and filing dates from Reyes's documents with the flat efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for 2 years and was not going to waste it. She heard him say Rosie's name once, in a register she hadn't heard from him before, and she turned away from the window and looked at the ceiling and breathed. At 2:15 a.m., he came back to the table. She's moving, he said. Emergency filing at 6 a.m. when the federal courthouse opens. She has enough to freeze the succession documents and open a formal investigation into Carver's asset structure. He sat down. She also said something I need to tell you. Elena looked at him. The operational team Carver brought in 8 months ago, the men Reyes saw, Voss has 2 of them on a separate surveillance file. They entered Oregon 6 days ago. He put his phone on the table. Not 3 days ago, 6. They were here before I was. The silence in the room was total except for the wind. They've been watching the cafe for 6 days, Elena said. Yes. While Rosie walked to school every morning. Yes. She stood up and walked to the kitchen and stood over the sink and ran the cold water and put both hands under it. The cold traveled up through her wrists and forearms, and she stood there until her hands were numb and her breathing was controlled, and she could return to the table without her face showing what she was actually feeling, which was a rage so clean and so complete that it had no texture to it, just a flat white surface that she could either use or be destroyed by. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She went back to the table and sat down. 6 days, she said, and tonight they know we're here. Probably. Not probably. Lucian held her gaze. Yes, tonight they know. So the 48 hours Reyes described may not be 48 hours. She looked at Reyes, who had been sitting very still through all of this in the way of a man who understood he was in a room with forces larger than himself and had the survival instinct to stay quiet. He looked back at her with the exhausted, stripped-down honesty of someone who had nothing left to protect. If Carver knows his legal mechanism is about to be frozen, Reyes said quietly, he'll move the timeline up. He won't wait. How far up? Elena said. As far as he needs to. She sat with that. Then she looked at Lucian. Wake your people up, all of them, right now. He was already reaching for his phone. The next 3 hours were the longest of Elena's life, and also the most compressed. Time doing the thing it did under extreme pressure, simultaneously infinite and instantaneous. Lucien's 2 men inside the house repositioned, one at the front and one covering the rear and the tree line. The man outside came in and was replaced by 2 others who arrived in a second vehicle at 3 a.m., moving quietly through the dark without lights. Reyes was moved to an interior room with no windows. Elena went back to Rosie's room and sat in the chair in the corner and watched her daughter sleep and did not allow herself to think about anything except the immediate physical reality of the room. The lamp's low light, the sound of Rosie's breathing, the weight of the chair under her, the door she'd left open 3 inches so she could hear the hallway. At 4:40 a.m., Rosie woke up. She surfaced from sleep the way she always did. Not gradually, but all at once. Eyes open, immediately present. She looked at Elena in the chair and didn't seem surprised to find her there. You didn't sleep, Rosie said. I'm okay. That's not what I said. Elena almost smiled. No, I didn't sleep. Rosie sat up and pulled Mister into her lap and looked at the door and then back at Elena with the silver-gray eyes that saw too much for 6 years old. Are the people outside our friends? Yes. Are there other people who aren't our friends? Elena looked at her daughter and made the decision she always made. The decision to give Rosie as much truth as she could hold without giving her the weight of the parts she couldn't. We're being very careful, she said. That's why there are people outside, so we can be careful. Rosie considered this. She looked down at Mister. She straightened his ears, which was the thing she did when she was thinking hard. Is the man with the sad eyes being careful too? She said. Yes. Okay. She looked up. Can I have breakfast? Yes, Elena said. You can have breakfast. She was making Rosie's cereal at 4:55 when Lucien appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Rosie first, a brief, involuntary look, the kind you couldn't stop, and then at Elena, and she saw in his face what she'd been seeing since the café, the continuous low-level impact of a man absorbing a reality he hadn't been present for and couldn't retroactively fix. He came to stand beside her at the counter, close enough to speak quietly without crossing the room. Movement on the state route, he said. His voice was barely above a breath. 2 vehicles. They passed the turnoff, same as last night, but this time they slowed. She kept her hands moving, pouring milk, her back to Rosie. How long? 20 minutes ago. They haven't come back past. Which means they took the logging road. Yes. She set the cereal in front of Rosie and straightened and looked at Lucien with the full understanding of what 20 minutes of repositioning time meant. He looked back at her with the same understanding. Voss, she said. I called her at 4:30. She's moving on the courthouse filing, but she can't have people here before 7 at the earliest. Local law enforcement is complicated. If I call them, it creates a paper trail that Carver's lawyers can use to challenge the federal filing. So we're on our own until 7. Until 7. She looked at Rosie, who was eating cereal with the focused contentment of a child who had decided that cereal was the relevant fact of the current moment and everything else was adult business. She looked at Mister propped against the cereal box. She looked at the kitchen window, which was covered by a shade that one of Lucian's men had pulled down when they arrived last night. What do you need me to do? She said. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in it. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of something he hadn't been certain of until now. There's a room at the center of the house. No exterior walls. I need you and Rosie in there. I need you to stay there regardless of what you hear. And if... Regardless, he said. Whatever you hear. She held his gaze, the thing she'd been managing since the café. The anger and the grief and the 7 years of distance and the new and terrible vulnerability of being in proximity to him again, compressed itself into a single point, and she looked at him across that point and said, "Don't get killed." He held her gaze for 1 second longer than was operationally necessary. "I'll do what I can." She took Rosie and Mister and the cereal bowl because Rosie was not finished with her cereal, and Elena was not going to be the person who interrupted it, to the interior room, which was a small square space off the main hallway with no windows and a heavy door and a lock on the inside that she engaged immediately. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, and Rosie settled beside her, completing her cereal with the tranquil focus of someone entirely unconcerned with the locking of doors. At 5:22 a.m., the first sound came from outside. Not a shot. Not yet. A sound like something heavy impacting the exterior wall on the north side, followed by a shout, cut short. Elena put her arm around Rosie and pulled her in and felt Rosie go still against her side. The particular stillness of a child who has understood that stillness is required. Then it became loud. She couldn't see any of it and could only reconstruct it from sound. Boots on the porch, the front door impacting its frame, voices in the main room overlapping, and then the sharp, specific percussion of a gunshot that Rosie flinched at against Elena's side, and Elena tightened her arm and said, low and even, "I've got you. I've got you." She said it on a loop quietly, not to calm herself, but because Rosie needed the sound of her voice, needed the proof of her mother's presence to be auditory and continuous. The sounds moved through the house. The hallway outside the door, feet, impact, something breaking, glass or furniture she couldn't tell. A second shot, closer this time, and a third that was further away, outside maybe, in the trees. Then silence. The silence was worse than the noise. She sat in it for 90 seconds, counting, her arm locked around Rosie, Mr. Crush between them. Then Lucien's voice, right outside the door. "Elena." She didn't move. "Elena, it's clear. Open the door." She turned the lock. She opened the door 3 inches and looked at him through the gap before she opened it fully. His coat was gone. There was a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled down the side of his face and dried to a dark line along his jaw. He was breathing hard, the chest-deep breathing of sustained physical exertion, and he was holding his left side with one hand in a way that was not casual. "You're hurt," she said. "I'm okay. That's not what I—" "How many were there?" "4 outside. 1 made it to the door." He moved the hand from his side slightly, and she saw the torn fabric of his shirt, something dark beneath. It's a graze. I've had worse." "That's a very low bar." Something moved through his expression that was almost a kind of exhausted relief, the involuntary response of a man who'd been holding too much tension for too long and had just heard something that punctured it slightly. "We need to move. 2 of mine are down, not badly. The 4 outside are contained. But contained means temporary." Rosie stepped out from behind Elena and looked at Lucien. She looked at the cut on his face with the clinical, unemotional attention of a child who is afraid but managing it. She reached up with her free hand, the one not holding Mister, and touched her own eyebrow in the corresponding location. "That's going to need a bandage," she said. Lucien looked at her, the same look as in the café, as on the porch, raw and undefended, lasting just a second before he controlled it. "Yeah," he said. "Probably. We have bandages at the café." "I know we can't go there right now," Rosie said, before either adult could speak, with the weary patience of a 6-year-old who was tracking more than they'd been told. "I'm just saying, for later." For later. Elena looked at her daughter and felt something break open in her chest that was not grief and not relief, but some combination of both. The specific feeling of loving someone so completely that their courage undoes you. At 6:10, Voss called. "Filing is done," she said. Her voice was clipped, efficient, the voice of someone who had been awake all night and was running on the specific fuel of a case finally breaking open. "Succession documents are frozen. Carver's legal team will know within the hour. I have 2 vehicles en route to your location. ETA 40 minutes. "There are 4 individuals contained on the property," Lucien said. He was on speaker, standing at the kitchen table with the cut above his eye still unattended and his left side held carefully. "Alive?" "Yes." "Good. I need them." A pause. "I also need Reyes. He comes in voluntarily and cooperates. I can offer him protection and consideration on any exposure." Lucien looked at Reyes, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway. Reyes nodded, one single exhausted movement. "He'll cooperate," Lucien said, "and Vale." Voss's voice shifted slightly, taking on the weight of the conversation she'd been building toward for 2 years. We need to talk about your situation. I know. Full cooperation. Everything. I know, he said again. That's what I'm offering. He ended the call and stood in the kitchen of the house that wasn't his, with the gray Oregon dawn beginning to show at the edges of the window shade. And Elena stood across from him with Rosie between them, and the three of them existed in the kitchen for a moment in the specific silence that follows violence. Not peaceful silence, not the silence of resolution, but the silence of something having passed through and left the room altered. Then Rosie said, "Can I have more cereal?" Lucien made a sound, short, involuntary, that was the closest thing to a laugh Elena had heard from him in 7 years. She got the box from the counter and poured it. Lucien sat down at the table, carefully, favoring his left side. She found the first aid kit in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one she'd cataloged last night when she was memorizing the kitchen, and she brought it to the table and sat beside him. She opened the kit. She found the gauze and the tape and the antiseptic. "This is going to sting," she said. "I know." She cleaned the cut. He didn't move. She could feel his pulse under her fingertips when she pressed the gauze to his temple. Elevated, gradually slowing, the body standing down from crisis 1 degree at a time. She taped the gauze in place and sat back and looked at her work. He was looking at her. Not with the operational precision, not with the managed control. Just looking at her the way he'd looked at her in the hotel lobby and in Powell's and every time since, with something underneath the surface of it that he hadn't named, and she hadn't asked him to name because there wasn't room for it yet. There hadn't been room for it since the moment he walked through the cafe door, and probably wouldn't be room for it until the immediate crisis had fully resolved itself, and they were both standing on ground that wasn't actively shifting under their feet. She put the first aid kit on the table between them. Outside, the dawn was coming in gray and cold over the fir trees, and 40 minutes away on the highway, Voss's vehicles were moving, and somewhere in the city, a legal filing was sitting in a federal courthouse system with Carver's name on it and a freeze order attached, and Rosie was eating her second bowl of cereal and Mister was propped against the cereal box, and the 4 men contained on the property had not yet understood that the operation they'd been sent to execute had already been legally dismantled while they were taking the logging road, and the man who had sent them was sitting in an office on the East Coast, watching a case he had spent 3 years building collapse in real time from the inside out. Voss arrived at 6:53 a.m. She was not what Elena had expected, though she hadn't spent much time constructing expectations. Mid-40s, compact, with short dark hair, and the kind of face that had stopped bothering with anything decorative a long time ago. She came through the front door with 2 agents behind her and took in the room with a single sweep. The overturned furniture, the broken glass near the hallway, Lucien at the kitchen table with gauze taped to his head, Reyes sitting against the wall with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and none of it visibly surprised her. She looked at Elena last. "Miss Cross," she said, "Agent Voss." Voss looked at Rosie, who was observing her from the kitchen table with the silver-gray eyes and the particular stillness she deployed when she was deciding what to make of a new person. Voss's expression did something brief and human at the sight of her, and then it didn't. "Let's get the child somewhere more comfortable," Voss said. "She stays where I can see her," Elena said. Voss accepted this without argument. She pulled out a chair and sat across from Lucien and put a recorder on the table between them, and looked at him with the focused attention of someone who had been building toward this conversation for 2 years and intended to use every minute of it. "Start at the beginning," Voss said. "Which beginning?" Lucien said. "Yours." He started talking. Elena listened from the counter where she stood with her second cup of coffee, the one she was actually drinking, and she heard him dismantle 7 years of constructed distance from consequences, the organization structure, the asset architecture, the names and dates and locations that Voss's recorder absorbed, with the indifferent efficiency of a machine that didn't require him to mean it, just to say it accurately. He said it accurately. She could hear the precision of it, the specificity, the way he gave Voss exactly what she needed without embellishment, and without the kind of strategic omission that would compromise the value of what he was offering. He named names she recognized and names she didn't. He described operations she'd known about peripherally and operations she'd never heard of. He He talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and when he stopped, Voss asked questions, and he answered those too, and at no point did he look at Elena, and at no point did she look away from him. At 8:30, one of Voss's agents appeared in the doorway and said two words that made Voss stand up from the table. "Carver's moving?" Voss looked at her agent. "Moving how?" "Private airfield in Jersey. Flight plan filed 40 minutes ago. International." Voss's jaw tightened by a fraction. She looked at Lucian. "Is there anything in what you've given me that creates grounds for an immediate detention hold?" Lucian looked at Reyes. Reyes set down his coffee mug. "The succession filing. If Carver personally authorized the filing before the freeze order was in place, and he did, I have the authorization chain in the documents. That's direct participation in a fraudulent legal mechanism designed to facilitate harm to a minor. Federal jurisdiction, no statute of limitations complications." He paused. "It's enough." Voss was already on her phone walking toward the front door. Elena looked at Lucien across the kitchen. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say yet. The thing that needed to be said was still several hours away, was still on the other side of the practical immediate business of federal agents and legal filings, and a man at an airfield in New Jersey who was about to discover that the legal architecture he'd spent 3 years constructing had been handed to the people most motivated to dismantle it. At 9:15, Voss came back inside. "He's detained," she said. Not triumphant. Factual. The voice of someone crossing an item off a list. "The airfield. Local field office picked him up." The room was quiet. Rosie looked up from the drawing she'd been making on the back of an envelope one of Lucien's men had given her. She'd asked for paper, and he'd produced the only paper in his jacket pocket, and she'd accepted it without comment and begun drawing immediately, the specific resourcefulness of a child who was going to make something regardless of conditions. "Is it done?" Rosie said. Everyone looked at her. She looked back at them with the silver-gray eyes, pencil in hand, the envelope covered in what appeared to be a house with an unreasonable number of windows. "The bad thing," she said. "Is it done?" Elena crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her daughter. She looked at Rosie's face, the jaw, the eyes, the particular steady quality of her attention, and she said, "Yes, the bad thing is done." Rosie looked at her for a moment, checking the calibration of the answer against whatever internal instrument she used for these assessments. Then she nodded and went back to her drawing. Elena stayed crouched there for a moment after Rosie looked down, her hand resting on her daughter's knee, the envelope and its many-windowed house in front of them both. She felt the 48 hours of sustained tension begin to release from her spine, vertebra by vertebra, the way cold leaves a room when the heat finally comes on. Not all at once, but undeniably, the direction of change clearly established. She stood. Lucien was watching her from the table. Voss was on her phone again in the hallway. Reyes had his eyes closed against the wall, not sleeping, just existing in the specific relief of a man who had been carrying something dangerous for 8 months and had finally put it down. She walked to the table and stood across from Lucien and looked at him. The gauze above his eye, the careful way he was holding his left side, the exhaustion that was finally showing through the controlled surface now that the immediate pressure had released. She thought about 26-year-old Elena Cross sitting in a borrowed apartment with a pregnancy test, and a message she'd believed because she'd had no reason not to. She thought about every morning for 6 years she'd rewritten the chalkboard menu with Rosie watching. She thought about the drawer with the photograph, which was still in the café, which she would go back to. "You owe me 7 years," she said. He held her gaze. "I know. I'm not telling you that to punish you. I'm telling you because it's true, and we both need to understand what we're standing on before we decide what comes next." "I understand it. You understand the fact of it." She kept her voice even. "Understanding what it cost is different." "I know that too." He said it quietly, with the specific weight of a man who is not going to argue with the truth. "I'm not asking you to forgive the 7 years. I'm not asking you for anything right now. He stopped. He looked at Rosie, drawing her impossible house, and then back at Elena. "I just need you to know that everything I have is going toward making sure she never has to be afraid of anything, whatever that requires, whatever it costs. That's not negotiable, and it's not conditional. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, she likes strawberry jam on her toast, not grape. She'll tell you grape is fine, but it isn't. She just doesn't want to seem difficult. Something moved through his face. Okay. And she doesn't like loud music in the morning. She needs about 20 minutes before she can handle noise. Okay. And her teacher is named Miss Ferris, and she thinks she's funny, which means you have to pretend Miss Ferris is funny, even if she isn't, because Rosie will be watching to see if you agree. He was very still. Okay, he said for the third time, in a voice that was lower than before. Elena held his gaze for one more moment, and then she went back to her daughter, and outside the Oregon dawn had fully arrived. Pale and clear after all the rain, the fir trees lit along their edges with the first real light of the day. Voss came back into the kitchen at 9:40 and said she needed another 2 hours from Lucien at minimum, that there were documents to sign and a formal statement to record, and the process of dismantling something took longer than building it always did. Lucien looked at Elena. Elena looked at Voss. He'll be there, she said, as though it were her answer to give, and then caught herself, and looked at Lucien, and he nodded once with something at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. Rosie finished her drawing and held it up. The house had 12 windows, a door exactly in the center, 3 figures standing in front of it, 2 tall, 1 small, and above it, in the careful block letters of a child who had recently learned to write, 3 words. Our house. Later. Elena took the drawing and held it, and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Lucien leaned forward slightly and looked at it from across the table, and this time he didn't control his expression fast enough. Rosie watched both of them with the silver-gray eyes, satisfied, already reaching for the pencil again. I need more paper, she said. The formal statement took 4 hours, not 2. Elena knew this because she watched the clock on the kitchen wall of the house that wasn't theirs move from 9:40 to 1:55 in the afternoon, while Lucien sat at the table with Voss and her recorder and her stack of documents, and Elena kept Rosie fed and occupied, and away from the procedural machinery of consequence being applied to 7 years of choices. She made lunch from what was in the kitchen, sandwiches, the plain kind, the kind Rosie would eat without negotiation. She found a deck of cards in a kitchen drawer and played 3 rounds of a game Rosie invented on the spot, with rules that changed whenever Rosie was losing, which Elena allowed because the sound of Rosie arguing the merits of her own rule changes was the most normal sound she'd heard in 36 hours. At one point, Rosie fell asleep on the couch with Mister on her chest, and Elena sat in the chair beside her and watched her breathe and did not look at the clock. When Lucien finally came out of the kitchen, his shirt was untucked and the gauze above his eye had been replaced with a cleaner bandage, which meant one of Voss's agents had attended to it, which meant Voss was thorough enough to make sure her witnesses stayed functional. He moved carefully. The left side, the graze, which Elena had decided to believe was a graze because she needed it to be a graze and because he was upright and moving, and those were the operational facts that mattered. He looked at Rosie on the couch and then at Elena in the chair. She okay? He said very quietly. She's fine. She invented a card game. Who won? She did. The rules ensured it. The corner of his mouth moved. He sat down in the other chair slowly and let out a breath that was longer than a normal breath, the specific exhalation of a man who had been holding his body at sustained tension for an extended period and was finally, conditionally, releasing it. They sat in the quiet of the room for a moment. Voss wants me in the city tomorrow, he said, and the day after. There's a process. I know there's a process. It won't be simple. The cooperation agreement covers a lot, but it doesn't cover everything, and there are people whose lawyers are going to try to make it complicated. He paused. I may not be accessible for periods of time while it works through. She looked at him. Are you telling me you might go to prison? He held her gaze. I'm telling you it's possible. For a period. Voss has structured the agreement to minimize it, but I've done things that have consequences, and I'm not going to pretend the consequences are all going to land on other people. She absorbed this. How possible? Less likely than it was yesterday. More likely than I'd prefer. She looked at her hands. She thought about what she'd said to him at the kitchen table. 7 years, what it cost, what they were standing on. She thought about what it meant to say those things to a man and then be told that what came next might involve a variable she couldn't control. Rosie will need to know who you are, she said. I know. Not the organization, not the specifics, but who you are to her. She's going to figure it out on her own if we don't tell her, and her figuring it out on her own will be worse. I know that too. She's going to have questions I can't answer about where you were. I'll answer them. He said it with the same simplicity he'd used when he said, "All right" in Powell's, in the Pacific Northwest section with the amber light, which felt like several lifetimes ago. Whatever she asks, I'll answer it honestly. Even the parts that aren't good, especially those. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the pale October light was moving toward afternoon, the shadows lengthening across the gravel of the driveway. One of Voss's vehicles was still parked outside. The operational presence was thinning. 2 agents gone in the last hour, the 4 detained men transferred to federal custody. Reyes taken to a location she hadn't been told and didn't need to know. The house was quieting. The particular silence of a situation that had been catastrophic and was now, incrementally, becoming manageable. When Voss is finished with you, Elena said, I'm going back to the cafe. He didn't argue. Okay. I need to go back. I need to reopen it. I need Rosie to go back to school and see Ms. Ferris and call Yuki and have the ordinary life that I built for her. Because the ordinary life was not wrong, it was right. And Carver and Vashti and all of it are not going to be the thing that defines what she grows up in. Okay, he said again. And you, she stopped, chose the words carefully. You don't get to walk back into that life as though the 7 years were a misunderstanding that got cleared up. That's not what they were. They were 7 years. They happened. They cost things that don't come back. I know. But she held his gaze. Rosie drew that house. He was very still. She drew it with 3 people in front of it, and she wrote our house on it, Elena said. She's 6 years old, and she drew that after knowing you for approximately 11 hours, which tells me something about what she already understands that she doesn't have the language for yet. She breathed. So, you don't get to walk back in, but you get to walk in slowly, if you're willing to do it slowly, and if you understand that slowly means on her terms, and then eventually on mine, and not the other way around. He looked at her across the room in the afternoon light, with the bandage above his eye and the left side he was holding carefully, and the exhaustion of a man who had spent 7 years building toward a moment and had arrived at it in a form he couldn't have predicted. I can do slowly, he said. It's going to be harder than anything you've done. I know. You think you know, she said. You'll actually know around month 3 when she decides she's angry at you for something that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with what she's processing, and you have to sit in that without defending yourself. I'll sit in it. She looked at him one more moment, then looked away, out the window, at the driveway, and the trees and the pale light. Okay, she said. Rosie slept for another 40 minutes and woke up with the same all-at-once completeness as always, looked at both of them in their chairs, and said she was hungry again, and the afternoon moved forward. 3 weeks later, groundwork reopened. Elena had spent the intervening time in a temporary rental 2 streets over while the cafe was assessed and repaired. There had been no structural damage to the building itself. The threat had never materialized inside it, but she'd had the locks changed and the security system replaced, and she'd had the back entrance reconfigured because she had a daughter. And she was a practical woman, and practical women updated their security systems when the world had demonstrated the current ones were insufficient. The morning she reopened, she rewrote the chalkboard menu herself, standing on the short stepladder, chalk in hand, Rosie sitting on the counter watching. Can I do the specials? Rosie said. You can do the specials. She handed Rosie the chalk. Rosie wrote specials in large uneven letters, and then, below it, blueberry scones, because she had been present for the scone incident on the day Lucien walked in and had apparently decided blueberry scones were historically significant. Elena looked at it for a moment. She left it exactly as written. Marcus came in at 7:14 and took his corner table, and Elena set his coffee down without being asked, and he looked at her with the 62-year-old perceptiveness of a man who had seen things he didn't talk about, and said, "Plants are fine," and unfolded his newspaper, and that was that. The Tuesday woman came back. The construction crew had moved on to a different project, but two of them came in separately on different days, which suggested the coffee had been the real draw and not the proximity to the job site. A new regular appeared. A young man with paint on his jacket who ordered the same thing every time and always seemed faintly surprised when she had it ready before he finished asking. Ordinary life, rebuilt from the same materials as before, arranged slightly differently. Lucian appeared for the first time on a Thursday morning, 3.5 weeks after the reopening. He came in at 8:30, which was not 7:14 Marcus territory, but was early enough that the cafe was still quiet. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, which meant he'd bought clothes at some point in the last weeks, which was such a mundane piece of information that she almost laughed at herself for noticing it. He looked better than he had at the house. The bandage was gone, a faint scar beginning its long process of fading above his left eyebrow, the left side no longer held with that careful self-awareness. He took a table near the window. Not the door table he'd taken the first time. The window. She brought him coffee without asking. He looked up at her when she set it down, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because some things had been said, and some things didn't need to be said yet. And the coffee was a fact that didn't require language. "Voss," she said, "last session was Tuesday. She'll want me again in 6 weeks." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "The cooperation agreement is holding." And Carver. "Detained pending trial. His lawyers are working, but the filing evidence is clean. Reyes is cooperating fully. It's going to hold." He paused. "It's going to hold." She nodded. She went back behind the counter. He stayed for an hour, reading something on his phone, drinking the coffee, and then a second cup when she refilled it without asking. And he didn't try to occupy more space in the morning than the table and the 2 cups in the hour. And she went about the business of the cafe and didn't watch him and was aware of exactly where he was in the room at all times, which she allowed herself because awareness was not the same as watching. When he left, he said, "Thursday." Just that. A question wearing the clothes of a statement. She considered. "Thursday's fine," she said. He left. The bell above the door rang, and the morning continued. Rosie came down at 9:30 with the backpack dragging, saw the empty cup at the window table, and looked at Elena. "The man with the sad eyes was here," Rosie said. He was. His eyes aren't as sad now. Elena looked at the window table, the empty cup, the particular quality of light coming through the glass on a November morning in Portland. "No," she said. "They're getting better." Rosie seemed to find this an acceptable development and turned her attention to demanding toast, which Elena made, and the morning continued. The Thursdays accumulated. Not dramatically. That was the thing Elena hadn't expected, though perhaps she should have. She had spent so much of the previous months in the register of crisis that she'd forgotten what ordinary forward motion looked like, the way time moved when nothing was trying to compress or destroy it. Lucien came on Thursdays and then on occasional Tuesdays, and the visits were unremarkable in their externals. Coffee, the window table, an hour, sometimes a conversation, and sometimes not. He learned that Marcus was not to be disturbed before the second cup. He learned that the Tuesday woman's name was apparently Diane because Rosie had asked her directly one morning and come back with this information as a report. He learned that the blueberry scones were Rosie's categorization and not a special, and that correcting this on the chalkboard was not something Elena was willing to do. He and Rosie developed their own language at a pace that Elena watched without intervening. It started with small things. Rosie reporting facts at him. About school, about Yuki, about the apparently complex internal politics of the first grade. He listened to all of it with complete attention, which was the right thing to do, and which Elena suspected came naturally to him because complete attention was how he processed everything. And Rosie recognized being genuinely heard the way all children recognized it, with a warmth that had no suspicion in it. Then Rosie started asking him questions. Not the question, not yet, not the one about where he had been and why he hadn't come sooner, The question Elena knew was forming in Rosie's mind the way storms formed, visibly on the horizon, approaching at their own pace. The smaller questions first. What was his favorite food? Whether he had been to the ocean. Whether he thought dogs were better than cats, which was a test Rosie applied to everyone whose character she was assessing, with dog preference being the correct answer for reasons she had not fully articulated. He said dogs. Rosie approved. The question came on a Sunday in December, not a Thursday, not during cafe hours. Lucien had come to pick them up. This had been agreed upon 2 weeks earlier, a trip to the coast, Rosie's first time seeing the Pacific. And they were in the car heading west on 26 through the Coast Range, Rosie in the back seat with Mr., and the specific vibrating energy of a child anticipating something large. Somewhere in the mountains, in the particular quiet of the car moving through the fur-dark tunnel of the pass, Rosie said, "Why didn't you come before?" The car continued. Rain on the windshield, the wipers moving. Elena watched the road and said nothing. Lucien's hands on the wheel were still. He took one breath, the long kind, the kind that was preparation rather than hesitation. "I made mistakes," he said. "Big ones. And there was someone who made sure I couldn't find your mom when I was trying to. It took me too long to figure out what had happened, and by the time I understood, a lot of time had gone by that I can't get back." Rosie was quiet for a moment. "Did you want to come?" "Yes." "The whole time?" "The whole time." Another silence. The rain, the wipers. "Okay," Rosie said. Elena exhaled. "Can we get clam chowder at the ocean?" Rosie said. "Yuki said there's clam chowder." "Yes," Lucien said. "We can get clam chowder." "Mister doesn't eat clam chowder. He's a rabbit." "That's reasonable." The coast range opened up, and the road descended toward the valley, and the rain softened, and through the windshield the sky ahead was lighter than the sky behind, the particular pale silver of the Oregon coast in winter, and Rosie narrated an elaborate theory about what the ocean would look like to Mister, who had never seen it, and Elena sat in the passenger seat and listened to her daughter's voice fill the car and felt the last of the weight she'd been carrying. Not all of it, not the weight that would take years to fully distribute, but the acute and crushing part of it, release its grip on the center of her chest, degree by degree, like the cold leaving a room when the heat comes on. They reached the coast at noon. The beach was almost empty. December, weekday. Wind off the water that was serious about its work. Rosie ran straight to the edge of the surf without hesitation, shoes immediately soaked, entirely unconcerned, holding Mister up toward the water as though introducing him to it. Elena stood back with Lucien and watched her. "She's not afraid of anything," he said. "She never has been." Elena kept her eyes on Rosie. "I used to worry about it. Whether I'd done her a disservice somehow, not teaching her to be more careful. Then I decided it wasn't a disservice. It was just her." "It's not a disservice," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was watching Rosie at the water's edge with the expression she'd stopped trying to name because it didn't need a name. It was simply what it was, a father watching his daughter for the first time in a place where there was nothing to protect her from and nothing to fear, and the water was just the water, and the wind was just the wind. "No," Elena said. "It's not." Rosie turned and ran back up the sand toward them, Mister swinging by one ear, face lit with cold and wind, and the pure animal joy of the ocean, and she grabbed both of their hands, one each, without looking, without thinking about it, the unselfconscious instinct of a child who had decided something and acted on it, and pulled them toward the water. "Come on," she said. "You have to see it up close." They went. The photograph still hung in groundwork, in the frame Elena had put it in the week after the reopening. The old one, the faded one from the kitchen drawer, the one that had started everything on the morning Rosie carried it across the cafe floor. Beside it, Elena had put a second frame, empty for the first 3 months, waiting for the right photograph. She put the coast photograph in it in January. Rosie had taken it on Lucien's phone, holding it with both hands, tilting it at an angle that captured more sky than people but caught them both. Elena and Lucien at the water's edge. Rosie's small shadow falling across the sand in front of them from where she stood to take the picture. All of them facing the Pacific, the winter light coming down flat and silver and entirely without judgment on whatever they were building. It wasn't a family portrait. It was something less arranged and more true than that. Three people at the edge of the water, the wind in it, the shadow of the child who had decided, before any of the adults had managed to, what the shape of things should be. Elena hung it on a Tuesday morning before opening, stepped back, and looked at both frames side by side. The old photograph and the new one. The broken promise and the thing being built from the materials left after the breaking. And she stood